Welcome and thank you all for joining this afternoon. We're going to take just a few moments to allow everyone a chance to enter into the room. While we do that, please note that you can use the chat box to ask any questions you may have. You can also use that for troubleshooting. So if you're having issues hearing or seeing today's presentation, please don't hesitate to use the chat box and I will assist you with that. Give it just a few more seconds as others get the chance to join in. And with that, I will pass it to Dr. Lawrence to get us started.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, Enrollment Management and Strategy. We are pleased that you have joined us this afternoon. The focus of this webinar will assist colleges and universities think about what their approach to enrollment management will look like as we continue to emerge from and out of this pandemic. How are changes in demographics, demand, and pricing sensitive to the market? And also, we'll take a look at how should articulation agreements be assessed right now between 4- and 2-year institutions. We are delighted to be joined by Christine Harper, who serves as Associate Vice President for Student Success and Chief Enrollment Officer at the University of Kentucky. Welcome, Christine. Also, we're joined by Anthony Jones, Associate Provost and Assistant Vice President for Enrollment Management at Howard University. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Jones. We're also joined by Mary Wagner, who is the Associate Vice President for Enrollment Management and Executive Director for Undergraduate Admissions at the University of South Carolina. Thank you for joining us as well, Mary. We're also joined from Huron, Steve Hahn, who serves as a Senior Director with that organization. At this time, I would like to turn this afternoon's presentation over to this afternoon's presenters. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lawrence, and it is certainly a pleasure to be with you all today. And on behalf of myself and my colleagues who are on the panel here, thank you for your interest in enrollment management, and we're looking forward to a great discussion over the next hour. As Dr. Lawrence mentioned, my name is Steve Hahn. I'm a Senior Director in Student Strategy at Huron Consulting, and I will be facilitating today's discussion. Prior to my role here, which is prior to 2020, and for the last 7 years, I was the Vice Provost for Enrollment at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I am grateful to be joined by the enrollment directors of such esteemed colleges as are represented on the panel here. As you all know, enrollment management exists at the very center of the university. And in many ways, it's the connection point between the academic and the financial, between the school itself and students and parents. Enrollment management sits at the intersection of the core of campus and its colleges or departments. And it also sits in the middle of a higher education ecosystem. And each of the panelists here represent a different ecosystem and a different role in that ecosystem. So with that, let's talk a little bit about our purpose today. And so we've had an extremely challenging year, as we all know, and the pandemic was only part of it. Last year, we had the confluence of not only the health crisis, but also the economic crisis that it engendered, and the availability crisis that it also engendered, as otherwise school attending students had to take care of family. In addition to that, we had important questions of social justice come to the fore. These are, of course, ongoing, but really came to the fore last year in a way that was very evident on our campuses. So our purpose today is to talk about, okay, coming out of that, in the roles of enrollment managers and with what we see ahead for our students and families and what we see ahead for college going behavior, how do we act? How do we proceed? And hopefully in the experiences of our panelists, you in the audience will see things that resonate with you as well, and it would be useful for you at your home institutions. So we want to look at what's working and what's new in terms of effective practices as we look at what we believe to be the pipeline coming at us and how we can adjust our enrollment strategy accordingly. Next slide, please. In terms of framing our discussion, we are dividing our discussion today into three different areas. And these are akin to the 3 or so hats that enrollment management wears on a campus. We have the hat for, of course, admissions and selectivity and preparation in whatever ways that has meaning for you and your institutions. That's found in admissions and therefore in enrollment. But in addition to selectivity and preparation, we also represent the mission of education in our state or in our ecosystem, and we represent access to that education for students and families. And so we wear that hat as well. And finally, in addition to those, we also represent the fact that it is our business to help the campus with tuition revenue and find a balance between the cost of attendance and maximizing tuition revenue on behalf of the campus. So we have organized our discussion in those 3 ways. And so let's begin on the next slide with a discussion of selectivity and preparation. And I'm going to ask our panelists to comment first on, maybe beginning down below, what broader themes are we noticing in student behavior post-pandemic? And what do you find is effective now in meeting the challenges of those new themes post-pandemic? In other words, to my colleagues, what are you seeing that might be new in student behavior? And what is effective now in reaching students that are exhibiting that new behavior? And you might also add, do we expect this behavior to continue? So with that, maybe Mary, maybe I'll start with you. What are you observing, and is this new, and how are you reacting to it?
Hi, Steve. Thank you all for having me here today. So I'm going to answer this question just initially from an admissions viewpoint, because I think we've always been, mesmerized by the fact that our jobs oftentimes in the admissions arena depend on being able to predict the behavior of 17-year-olds. And so that's already hard enough as it is in a good year. But we have found that students are increasingly waiting to the last minute to do everything. They've always had a tendency to do that, but we are seeing that different types of operational concerns, like when you pay a deposit or getting access to other kinds of downstream systems and things like that, students are holding out to the last minute and not responding right away. I think that their attention is also very fractured at this point, as all of us are experiencing. We find that if we try to host any kind of an event, for example, that's more than 20 or 30 minutes in length, everybody taps out pretty quickly. And so it tends to be, people are just asking, what do I need to do? What do I need to do? How do I access that? And then what's the next thing? And everything is just kind of feels very transactional, at least in the way a lot of people are asking us questions. And then the final component is the value one. I mean, I think we're starting to see more and more families be really honest with their kids about the kinds of, if you're going to go to this institution, and maybe it's a little bit of a stretch for us to send a student to your institution, and what kinds of economies are we going to adopt in order to make that happen for you? And so this, this era of, paying for this lifestyle experience is probably less of an issue for a lot of our families now that they're really kind of grappling with having dealt with 2 recessions within their child's lifetime.
Mary, I'm gonna, if it's okay, Steve, I'll go ahead and jump into that, because we just had our high school counselor advisory board last week, and both in-state and out-of-state students, and a lot of things that you're saying, they were just echoing that the students, they don't believe their students are going to be prepared to make a decision May 1. There's a lot of, students that are, because they're learning experience has been different for a number. The non-traditional instruction has been really challenging, and a lot of that structure, and whether it was being in school and the reminders they saw, or just feeling pretty comfortable, a lot of things are up in the air, and our students are certainly experiencing that. And the high school counselors were saying a lot of similar things. They're concerned that the students aren't sure what to do, feel like they don't have enough information, even though they've gotten all of the financial aid packages right now, are thinking about whether, you know, a 2-year or a 4-year, well, they thought 4-year, but now they may be thinking 2-year, feel like they're just not ready to take that next step. And so, which is a different kind of place and different reaction than we've heard before. And we also just don't have, as we've tried to go through as many different channels and touch points, we just don't have as many ways to get that feedback. And additionally, the transactional piece is really critical. Unfortunately, that is what it is. Right message at the right time to get the right reaction, because the space is limited. And so how do you get that information out in a way that's consumable with very clear instructions and a call to action? And that's what we're seeing is working the best right now, because there's so many external factors, but also our students are dealing, and others are dealing with, a lot of personal challenges through the pandemic.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you, colleagues. And thank you also for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. When we step back a moment and we take a look at the larger economic impact that the pandemic has had, and by the way, I would take a little issue with the way that the question is phrased. It does use the word post-pandemic, and I'm not quite certain that we can actually celebrate yet and call it post. But that being said, the economic factors are such that when you begin to evaluate what communities are being hit the most, and even break that down further in terms of what gender factors are being hit in those communities, you often find that Black women are being most disaffected by the pandemic. When you look at family structure within the Black community, you begin to find more single parent homes that are run by Black women. And so when you equate the two, then you have to realize that as it goes for first generation students, we are likely going to see a direct correlation of their activity around college going and the economy. And we certainly are seeing that. When you look at recent statistics that were shown about first gen and college common application, fee waiver requests, both are down, right? And so I think that this is something that is going to have a long-term effect that we're going to have to continue to pay attention to. We're going to have to go deeper into the pipeline to have conversations with our most vulnerable populations about going to college. We'll have to think differently about how to get them more early involved into the college going process. And of course, as we may talk about later on with a few of the other questions, how we are evaluating these students going forward. So I think that this is a key trend that is going to be very detrimental if we don't understand it well and work very hard to get our arms around it as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for that. And AJ, going with that evaluation question, how has the necessity in many cases of test optional in terms just as a fact of what we need to do because of the opportunities are not there. Many schools have adopted either a short-term or medium-term approach to test optional, but that has some yield effects in that we no longer have the perspective on who is serious about us that would come from such test taking, but also in terms of evaluation. So maybe AJ, can you comment on your approach to this and the evaluation of students in general in this environment? And then our other panelists, please, as well.
Well, I think that this is a good time to admit that none of us have an exact script for how this is all supposed to work and supposed to go. For those who do, come on over to Howard. We love to chat. But what we do know is that the fundamentals of our process in higher education, those of us that have moderate to highly selective processes, are still very much the same. I mean, the pillars are still there. We need to make an evaluation as to fit and agility and persistence. And so in doing that, for us, it has been more reliance on the non-cognitive factors than what we've had before. We've done a lot more training of our readers to be more analytical in our holistic reading. We have used more data points like College Board landscape, for example, is another. And we've also brought our what we call undergraduate studies, which is where our academic student support services sit, more ingrained into that selection process. We've created a method where we are engaging their comments, thoughts, reactions to some of the decisions that we're making. I would just end this part by just saying that a thriving idea for us, Steve, has been how does this selection process within the pandemic stand up to meeting our overall mission, right? Howard, as I'm sure the institutions that are represented here, is extremely mission driven. We understand to whom we are committed. And so at the end of the day, we have to stand up to that mission and ask ourselves the tough questions that we meet it. And so it is really a driving principle as we make those final decisions.
And I'm happy to jump in now to talk about our process a little bit. Mission-driven is certainly a place that University of Kentucky is, and we sit in Kentucky, which is a state that has some very economic challenges. To some of AJ's earlier points, our first-gen and low-income students substantially impacted through this pandemic. I'm going to take a little bit of a different lean on this because I think that from where I sit, one of the big pieces that I had to work through was a very quick data analysis, because we have, in terms of our process, and we have a holistic admissions process, but we also have selective, some of our colleges are more open and some are selective. And so we had some colleges, I'll take the College of Engineering, who had a test score threshold. And so to quickly go through and do a 5-year analysis of previous cohorts to look at the grades that they got in courses, and then look at retention rates moving forward, and come up with having meetings with each of the college leadership, and then meeting with their faculty. It was a pretty big process to get test optional off the ground and going. And I think that that's a piece that it's not as easy as saying we're going test optional. When you're looking at our faculty governance and the admissions decisions, that really colleges are the best to know what a student needs to be successful. And we take that and then we inform that process, however our admissions processes are, but we are looking at what they're giving us. It's a substantial amount of work to move that forward and move it in a way that all of our campus community is comfortable, and then a lot of future analysis that we'll be doing to provide that feedback loop about how our process went this year. So quickly on a dime, with having to make that decision, I would say probably 40 meetings within 3 weeks with all the college leadership, and to come back. And that even goes to prerequisite requirements. So we were working with the math department and we were working with the chemistry department to come up with test optional approaches for how to, the prerequisites that are required for some of the entry-level courses. So there's a lot of work in there. And then now we had a 1-year pilot. We've had that expanded. So we have 3 additional years, excuse me. So a total of 4. And all of that had to go through our faculty senate and reviewed. So in addition to how are we changing our processes, there's a whole nother mechanism with faculty governance and looking at the institution's college by college needs and meeting those, as well as also meeting our state guidance with the Council on Post-Secondary Education, working with them, because our Council on Post-Secondary Education has some requirements for students' college readiness that were all predicated on test scores. And so we've been proposing moving some test optional in certain ways, and have had success in doing that. So outside of our process, a lot of other administrative pieces that have to go on to bring the entire university along. And now for us, in that next couple of years pilot, the reason that we got it extended for the next 3 years is because, and I agree with AJ, we're not post-pandemic yet. We have students that are coming to us that are a year and a half in non-traditional instruction, some of them, I think the majority of them, right? So we will have students for the next couple of years that were impacted, whether they were sophomores or juniors. So we want to be able to understand when they matriculate to us, how was their instruction in their high school? Was it hybrid? Was it non-traditional? Was it in person? And then look at how they perform when they get to UK, and then use that to then inform those, whether it's college by college or our overall process, so that we make sure that we are meeting the needs both of the accessibility for the Commonwealth of the students and beyond, but then also the retention goals that we have in student success, because ultimately we want to make sure that we have a process that not only students can thrive, but also for some students that is a good fit, and the measures that we're using put them in a place for good success, whether that's overall outcomes or prerequisite courses and those sorts of things.
Thank you. Mary, has this engendered any changes in the way that you are reviewing, or maybe will continue to review?
Well, it certainly has. And South Carolina has been an institution that I think, you know, until the pandemic, we were pretty formulaic in a lot of our decisions. We had some layers of high ability access programs that were very, very holistic and have been for a number of years. But I think the pandemic is going to cast a really long shadow, even after people get back into school, so to speak, and are going through their, everybody's really reeling from a lot of challenges and perspectives and experiences that no one ever thought that they would end up having to deal with. And there's going to be stuff that's going to come up, I think, in a lot of students' lives. We're going to see these things kind of, you know, lag in the transcripts for a couple of years, when we kind of see how students are responding to how they're explaining what went on in their educational environment. And, you know, you've got kids who are, you know, seniors now who are dealing with going through their entire senior year in a hybrid or mostly online environment. And then you've got students in a lot of the foundational coursework in their freshman year of high school that are also trying to do this and move into that new environment. And so I just think we all are wise to kind of watch how this is going to impact the students that are coming to us. And I know the larger conversations, at least for us, I mean, every institution is going to kind of have their own way that they try to make the test optional holistic process manifest, right? You know, we're doing more contextually based review. We've hired people to read files, and we've seen an increase in the number of people applying because we're test optional. Right now, so many of the challenges, I think, are we have a lot of great inflation that's going on across the country, and in the absence of having some other type of assessment, it does make it a little bit harder to evaluate a student who's not stellar relative to their peers, because everybody appears to have really high grades right now. And so trying to go in and read in a little bit more nuanced way has been challenging for us, but I think it's worth it. The larger conversations that we're having with our institutions is our departments is managing expectations and being ready for students coming in who may not have the appropriate skill set for handling this kind of a transition very quickly, and worrying about what kinds of behaviors may come up on campus when students kind of feel like, woo, I'm free and hanging out on campus and having a good time, and trying to marry those concerns with making sure students stay on track. So again, long shadow. I don't think we're out of it yet. And we're going to even see our new students who successfully, you know, cross the transom of high school to college are going to be dealing with some adjustment issues that they haven't even thought about.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you for those insights, everyone. And point well taken about the pandemic and whether it's post or not, I think is a question of geography and affluence at the moment. So point is well taken there. If we could move to the next slide, let's talk about the second hat in enrollment management regarding our mission to representation and access. And last year and this year are challenging in a variety of different ways. As I've noted on the slide here, the pandemic did not create things that we have not seen. It accelerated them and it pointed them up and gave great, in a very obvious and contrasting way. And as we all know, vulnerability is not shared equally among our students. Economic vulnerability or vulnerability in terms of their role on campus or their place on campus. And so I wanted to talk a little bit as we as we speak to those students who are most vulnerable, and we do so in a way that meets them economically, but also meets them in terms of, what they are looking for, hearing from us. What are some strategies that we can deploy or maybe have deployed in order to maybe address the campus climate issue regarding the events of last June, or the events of last year in an ongoing way, or the economic vulnerability that many are feeling? What are some, and this is a broad question, I know, but what are some innovative practices that you are employing on your campus to work with vulnerable students at the economic and the social and the wellness perspective, all of which I think came to the fore last year, and for many are still ongoing? And AJ, maybe I'll start with you on this one.
Thanks, Steve. There's no secret that Howard University has a long history of dealing with social justice issues, topics. Our student, faculty, and alumni have been very engaged in the social justice movement practically from our very beginning. And so really that has been part of our brand and draw. When we ask students questions like, why did you choose to come to Howard University? Themes like social justice often rise to the top. So for us, it has always been the case of of capsulizing this idea and making certain that we project it as part of our branding and marketing and advertising. So there hasn't been a real change in conversation that we've had. We just tell students that they're going to be in a more structured environment to address the issues of social justice, not only from an activist standpoint, but also an academic standpoint. And that is that helps us with that conversation. Now, as it relates to how we deal uniquely with vulnerable populations, this is obviously something that's been of concern for ours for a very long time, given the percentage of our students that come to us who are Pell eligible, and the university's, I'm thankful to say, stellar ability to graduate those students well above the national average graduation rates for 4 and 6 years. And part of what that means for us is that, number one, we start the financial aid conversation with students far earlier in the cycle than perhaps most institutions. We are talking with them in pipeline schools about the financial aid. When they come in, they are connected to a financial literacy program that is sort of embedded in various schools and colleges. We use ECMC modules. There are about 15 modules that we have available for students, and we sort of allow students to badge those in a portfolio so that once they graduate, they have accumulated these financial literacy lessons, if you will. And then there is the financial support. We have what's called a GRACE grant that matches the Pell Grant for Pell Grant students. So whatever Pell Grant amount for which they're eligible, they get a GRACE grant to match that. And we also have a unique grant that we call the Summer Stage Grant. And so for students that meet the criteria, so there is a GPA, there is a credit hour, and there is an EFC criteria. And if they do, they get 6 free credit hours of study for the summer. And so that has helped to accelerate students towards graduation, and also, as you said, Steve, really help those more vulnerable populations. What we are now looking at and focusing on is, through our analysis, we're seeing of the students that are coming to us in this fall's class that are going to fall in this most vulnerable bucket. Are there micro grants that we could set aside for these students and target them with these micro grants in the sophomore and even in the junior year? Now, the expense of all of this, for those of you who are wondering about that, thankfully, we've not been driving up the discount rate. We've been able to tap on some donor funding, some restricted funding to be able to support this. But also, we're being creative in terms of the dollars that we bring back to budget by graduating our graduating seniors. That's sort of helping us to pay for some of what it is that we are doing. So we are very conscious of these vulnerable students and what is happening in their various communities. I should probably just close with the fact that we realized a huge savings for our students when we did go remote. Our entire school has been remote since March of last year. And so we are going to offer hybrid very intentionally for the upcoming fall to not only from a safety vantage point, give students options, but also from a cost vantage point.
Yeah, thank you. Mary, Christine, anyone else?
Well, I was going to say a lot of those same strategies, are popular ones at many institutions. I heard some similar ones that that we do at South Carolina, but also thinking about being able to serve those students also means being able to attract them. And so some of the other comments that have been made, like a decline in the number of fee waiver eligible students who are applying, or a decline in the number of Pell eligible students that seem to be in the applicant pool. And so I know that you plan on talking about this a little bit later, but this bifurcation of the applicant pool, which is becoming in the student body, that's becoming increasingly worrisome, where you have all the aid. It's almost kind of like in a U-shaped distribution. You have really, really wealthy kids who tend to do really well on standardized test scores, qualifying for all the merit aid, and low income students on the other end who are first gen and qualify for all the need-based aid programs that institutions can commit to. And that's worrisome as well. But income-based covenant aid programs for first-gen students and South Carolina residents. We've been doing this for a number of years as well. The microgrant program is very popular. Also really paying attention to being overt about inclusive recruitment practices, making sure that recruitment activities are representative of the student body, that our staff is becoming more diverse, that we are more intentional about leading with conversations regarding sensitivity to price, or being a part of a community where not everybody comes from, parents, both of whom may have advanced degrees or college degrees, and what does it mean to be a first gen student on campus and how you fit in. And so all those things are part of the largest solution of trying to address all different types of students on the socioeconomic continuum, and as well as the racial and ethnic inclusion agenda for the university.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree that we have very similar programs in terms of some of our interventions relative to financial aid and financial need. We did use created a new fund, because we've had most coming in for like our UK Leads program, which is really based on financial need and knowing that students that have $5,000 or more in terms of the amount that they have to pay have less likelihood of retaining, really focusing funds that way. We also then created one this year, which was on the top end, so kind of a retention graduation, so really focused on junior seniors to get them over the finish line. The HERF funds, the CRISA CARES, I'm sure that each institution has seen those. Those are short-term things that have helped. I was really pleased, I'm sure other institutions were, that the CRISA funds, which was kind of the second, so you have HERF 1, HERF 2 was much more broad in terms of what we could use it for, and same with the third round that's coming out, and that's really helped students that were currently on our campus with some of the needs that they were having. I do very much agree that there are challenges in the kind of lost populations, and how do we find them and access them, as we're seeing fewer FAFSA filers, and we're seeing first generation students decrease and fee waivers on applications decrease. And we around in Kentucky actually had our president joined with a couple other presidents to write some op-eds, and we're really doing some different kinds of media pushes. But the challenge is getting that message out there early. And I think AJ pointed to a lot of really early outreach and continuing to do that. One of the things that I will say from the financial piece of it too is that with the test optional admissions, we also moved our scholarship and merit aids to made merit aid offerings to be test optional this year too. That being said, we don't have an unlimited budget, so we didn't guarantee students as we historically did. If you applied by a certain date, everybody, and you met these this threshold, because we knew that by opening it up to test optional, we would have more students likely qualify, even though we kind of changed using the data that we provided. And we were not able to offer everybody, but we did see a very significant change in distribution of those merit aid awards, both from a socioeconomic level as well as the diversity of our students that were able to access, and really saw some students from different areas that had not necessarily geographically also qualified and come through that program. So that's something that as we go through, we'll continue to evaluate, because we also did have some really upset students that historically this is how it was, and they had heard that, and we did have a change, but I think it was a change for the better. We need to continue to evaluate that. Circling back around to some of the earlier pieces too about the students coming to our institutions and social justice and those sorts of things. I mean, Kentucky, there was a lot going on. Breonna Taylor, just down the road from us, a lot of opportunities for discussion, debate, but also a lot of hurt. And I think some of the things we were talking a little bit about we're focused on our students, but we also have faculty and staff that we're dealing with a lot of trauma too. And so as a campus community, there's a lot of conversation, a lot of healing, a lot of support, a lot of taking a step back and saying, how can we support everyone that is dealing with this in the ways that they're dealing with them in the best way possible. Some of the actual tactical pieces that I would say came out of that is that we, and I'm sure a number of other institutions may have seen this too, a substantial increase in individuals highlighting, hey, you admitted this student and here's something you should know about them. Here's a social media clip of this student that you admitted and they shouldn't be a student at UK. And so really we have a process for current students, but the students that are incoming, it's a different approach. And as a public institution, we can't necessarily, make a decision, well, we're going to rescind. We have rationale that we can move that forward. But what we did do this year was add at the point of confirmation when a student confirms with us that they have to acknowledge the expectations of our campus community, what they're joining, what we expect. And so that's part of the first thing they have to click when they want to confirm is read this information. We also have a substantial process now for when those items come in that we will be having very good conversations through Dean of Students office with prospective students, as well as, like I said, the process we had for current students still stands, but we can have conversations and start that conversation before they come to campus. And so that's something that really came together very quickly and something that we needed to do. We had been, prior to all of this, working on some substantial DE&I efforts and have about 25 work groups across campus that we've been working on over the past year and a half, almost 2 years. And I happen to be on one of the work groups that is focused on kind of campus debate and responsible use of speech. And what we hear a lot from our students on campus, and we know that we have students that are really in an activist mind frame, which is fantastic. We have a lot of students that are sharing out, and we want to be able to support our students, but we also have an obligation to have a free speech area on campus where people can come. And so we've done things like anytime somebody's coming that has a really challenging message that has that space, we have administrators that go out and stand around and identify themselves so that at least the students see that there's somebody there that if they are challenged, and it's not just to make sure nothing happens, it's to show a sign of support. And we've shared that with the campus community, and our students in particular were very positive about that. One of the things that we've talked about too about responsible or speech in particular, and the challenge of hate speech on a campus, and there's the free speech obligation, but there's nothing that says that the college or university can't equally speak with that same amount of challenge. And so what we are talking through is how we work through that and how we really make that an emphasis. And then also, what do our students and frankly faculty and staff all need? But we're focusing mostly on our students. there's a real challenge with having debate and what does a college campus and what does that discourse look like? And how can you have challenge and debate in a setting that is respectful, isn't about a winner and a loser? And we think that by focusing on some of those things, we can continue to grow and learn together from one another instead of having very challenging situations that are explosive, which you don't want to have. They're still going to happen, but we can do a better part on educating all of our students and our campus community about what is and isn't acceptable, and do that in a more formal way.
Yeah.
Steve, if I could just say that there is a theme that has existed pre-pandemic that has gotten really ignored as the sensationalism around the pandemic has grown, and in many respects, rightfully so. And that is the issue of trust and the diminution of that trust between the public and higher education. We know that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, certainly safe to say 50 years ago, college and universities were seen as the sole mechanism to move from one class to the next. However, we've all walked through increases in pricing without explanation. We have seen how this has become politicized. We have seen the reaction of that in various communities that have risen up and questioned the very relevance of the major institutions that are in their area. And so this is not going away. You talked earlier, Steve, about how the pandemic has exacerbated some things. I think that this is one of the primary things that is being exacerbated, but not being studied or highlighted at this point because we're so focused on the pandemic. So the question that I think we have to ask ourselves is when we do become post-pandemic, where will the relationship between higher education and the greater community lie? And will we have enough to be able to reconstruct what we enjoyed 50 years ago in terms of the pathway through which one acquires the American dream? And if we don't, then we are going to have to be really innovative and reinvent ourselves to match what are the expectations of families and students, which are dramatically changing at this particular point. So I just want to put on the table the issue of trust and how critical understanding that and examining that and making that a part of your strategic thinking is for colleges and universities.
What a wonderful point. Let us talk about that a little bit and turn to the next topic in terms of, the public's perception of cost of attendance, and are we being faithful stewards of the tuition and state dollars, and do we have their trust to spend those dollars wisely and to educate their children? And let's spend a few minutes on this. And I want to just alert the room that we will save a few minutes at the end. So if you have questions, please enter them into the chat or the QA, and we will look at them and deal with as many, or answer as many as we can by the end of our hour here today. But let's talk a little bit about tuition revenue and price. We talked a little bit earlier about the pandemic polarizing our cohorts, and again, this is not new. But I suspect that you all may agree that it has been exacerbated by the pandemic. But let me just ask this, and Mary, if I could start with you again, please. Has the experience of this last year caused you and your state institution, has it caused you to think differently about the cohort mix? The residency mix or other tuition mixes going forward, maybe now and continuing in ways that were not maybe politically possible earlier or as palatable to your state. Talk a little bit about the way that this has affected your residency mix.
Yeah, well, as a public institution, I like how you kind of threw in that disclaimer about political ramifications and things like that. And as a public institution and the flagship for the state of South Carolina, we've always prioritized South Carolinians above everything else. But In fact, even over the past 5 years, we've been able to grow the number of South Carolinians in our freshman class by about 38% compared to only growing the freshman class by about 12% overall. So, but trying to help people kind of understand math and proportions sometimes gets lost in the mix. And so, if we want to grow, we have to grow with out-of-state students because there's more students living in the other 49 states than live in the state of South Carolina. We've done that math and we know that to be true. And so us being small, the only way we can grow is out of state. And so you are thinking a lot more about the net tuition implications about how to leverage aid in order to be able to attract the appropriate mix of students who are willing to pay something to come to the institution without having your in-state students be displaced in any way. And so I think, yes, the residency mix, I mean, you're not you're not a public institution if you aren't thinking about residency mix in this type of an environment. I think everybody's having really very difficult, very focused conversations about what the budget can bear, given what happened last year and how you're recovering this year. And so I think it is forcing a lot of conversations about, okay, we know we have this desired mix that would be great in a fantastic year, but given the limitations of what we can actually achieve, what our applicant pool looks like, what our resources are to support students like Kentucky, we don't have an unlimited pool of aid. We don't post a grid to the web and say, if you meet these requirements, you're going to get these awards. We have to reevaluate that based on the product mix that we have, or the what caps we have, what enrollment goals we have, what revenue goals, all those things come into play. So I would just say that those conversations usually start out one way at the beginning of the year. And then as your year progresses, I know at least for us, we oftentimes have to evaluate where we stand relative to what the budgeting process looks like with the state. And so sometimes those things can kind of change up at the last minute based on that. But, you're probably not in enrollment management if you're not talking about your residency and your tuition revenue mix at this point. And I feel like those conversations are going to be ongoing throughout the summer as well.
Christine, state institution, any changes in how you're building your class?
No, very similar to Mary. I mean, our population is a smaller population. We also have a number of public four-year institutions in the state, and our opportunity. I mean, we wanted to make sure over the past couple of years that we are solidifying and that we are accessible to all of our Kentuckians, and making sure that we're delivering on those promises. But to expand, we really have to expand in new markets and out-of-state areas and make that attractive. And I think there's also, a strong message about the importance of that kind of diversity that is created on campus when you have a good mix. I know that at the undergraduate level, we have been growing, and we have grown a little bit in our non-resident over the past 2 years, but very small. We've been able actually grown a little bit more in Kentucky. So our percentage has stayed around the same for the last 2 to 3 years, but that's going to shift if we continue to have growth goals, because as Mary stated, the population just isn't there. But that education of those that are looking at that is really important, because there are assumptions, and you can have a legislature asking you substantial questions to validate and verify the direction that you're going, and so it is a delicate dance that you have to work through. But at the same time, the data is there to support the movements that you're making moving forward. I think beyond, tuition this year, one of the things I can say that we were working through at the state level was there was this assumption that across the board, nobody should have tuition increases because everybody got tons of federal dollars. Well, federal dollars, for us, I mean, we've been doing testing of all of our students, our modality shift, where's differential pricing for online. There's a substantial deficit that we're running based on all of the impacts in COVID. And so while we've gotten some funds nowhere near what it would take to make us whole. And so there are just some assumptions that also you're negotiating, that as you're having those conversations. And I think too, the shift with COVID and the pandemic and moving remote and all of the challenges, and we'll circle back to this last slide, all those challenges that occurred in March when everybody was moving out and there were all these things really also, I think, impacted our incoming students this year, because there seems to be more concern about paying a deposit because it might be binding. And if I sign up for housing, is that binding? And will I be stuck in this contract? And so there are things that were just assumed, like, oh yes, do it. And then if you don't want to come, you can, not move forward with your housing application or just withdraw, and we'll, take care of that. We're hearing a lot more from students because of all of that, like very loud national conversation about that movement out, that there's a lot more, a number of more weary students and parents about what am I really agreeing to, and is this going to be a residential experience? And if I'm paying this tuition, is it residential? What am I paying for? And so there's a lot more, I think, circling back to AJ's trust issue, there, that clear, transparent communication, and what you say needs to be what it is. And then understanding that we can all say we're going to be in one place, but if there's a second iteration, and if the state governor says you're going to be doing X, then you have to comply. So there's a lot kind of built in there in terms of the political pieces. Even if you get into, are you going to be testing or requiring vaccination on campus, and working with, depending upon what state you're in, how are those conversations going, and what are you going to do, and where are the places that you're going to take a stand, whether it's tuition or anything that's coming down the pike. And so there's a lot of information gathering and a lot of conversations to make sure that we can get to a great place for our campus community and the students involved. But yeah, circling back, the residency mix, there's nowhere for us to go except for to shift that, but knowing it's going to be a continued conversation, that we need to have the data to support, not only quantitatively, but then qualitatively, what the experience and the benefit there is.
And if I could just add one thing too, for public institutions, for those who are on the call, I mean, having the out-of-state students really it helps subsidize a lot of the aid programs that are so essential to our in-state students and help the institution fulfill their mission. And so also that becomes part of the political discussion, or just trying to help people understand that having out-of-state students is actually really good for a lot of state institutions.
Steve, I just wanted to add that as we were thinking about our regular decision students, having come out of our EAED, completing early action, early decision, completing that, and now thinking about our regular decision mix, as well as now talking about our waitlist students, we really wanted to think more strategically around net tuition revenue by major, looking at sort of de-emphasizing some majors that in which we were overprescribed, and how could we capitalize on higher net tuition revenue for other majors where we needed to beef up enrollment. So that was something that was very important to us. But there's another factor that I want to introduce to the conversation, and that is in our need to care for the most vulnerable in our population, as we've talked about already, there is the opposite effect to the point that Mary just made of the students who will need to pay for that. In the case that you mentioned, Mary, obviously you were talking about out-of-state students. In the scenario I'm talking about more high mean students in our mix. And if we are putting more pressure on those families with, for example, less aid in scholarship, merit-based, and certainly need-based, then what happens to those families in terms of how they react to these offers? They are better in position to take advantage of other higher educational options or career options, right? If you think about what's happening within the tech industry and what Google is developing that sort of sidesteps higher education altogether to get into the tech world. So as we're thinking about long-term for higher ed, and we're thinking about funding models for financial assistance models for students and funding models for ourselves, I think we are smart to be thinking not just about that vulnerable population, but really thinking seriously about how the impact of cost is going to affect those families of higher means, who, by the way, didn't necessarily fare well across the board in terms of economics in the pandemic. Yes, two-parent households, yes, more college educated households did do better. But in the long-term analyses, when you look at the hit that was on 401ks, when you look at the hit that was on bonuses and so forth, things that people tend to use in order to pay for higher education that do have higher means, those issues say to us that we need to be tracking that so that we can sort of begin to predict how those higher mean families are going to be reacting to our request that they pay a little more.
Excellent, excellent point. Thank you all for that. We're coming up on the top of our hour here, and I want to leave a few minutes for questions. And so why don't we turn to that now? And let's look at our questions. Before we do that, I wanted to make the room aware that the next session in this series of talks for SREB is entitled Ensuring Community Colleges Emerge from the Pandemic Stronger on May 12th. And so I'm sure this will be publicized through the usual channels, but I wanted to make you aware that we've got a dedicated conversation on community colleges coming up in the very near future. So with that, let's move to questions. And I see one posted. What role will international students play in our future here? And are they also test optional? So who would like to comment on the role going forward, that maybe over-reliance? Have we enjoyed an over-reliance on international, or are we looking forward to their return? Who would like to address that?
I think it depends on the institution in terms of the over-reliance. It really can be very different. And I think that an over-reliance also could be really geographically targeted too. So if you have an institution that was very heavy in pipeline programs and engagement with international students, and that, from China, for example, substantially more impacted through the pandemic than those that may have different areas of the country, of the world, or working with multiple countries in a more diverse mix. So I think it is pretty dependent on the institution. We had some pipelines with students in China and did see some of that, but we have a pretty diverse mix. We're been growing in that area, and an area that we're going to continue to grow, because again, we do think it's really important, not just for our undergraduate students, but also at the graduate and professional level, for our international population, the diversity on campus, and the different perspectives that are brought to campus. I think there was also a piece of whether they were test optional. Yes, our students, international students, were test optional as they were coming through, with a couple small pieces in terms of possible TOEFL or other requirements or proficiencies that we would need for an assessment for them. But I do think it's pretty dependent on the institution that you're sitting at. I can say this year we've actually seen, I think nationally, there's been a major increase in international applications. Our numbers are of different countries that students are applying from has been pretty substantial in terms of the increase there. And so I think that those are just, well, it'd be interesting again to see where this cycle levels out and where we all land after seeing some really interesting trends, whether it's test optional or international interest in US institutions. There's a lot of unanswered questions that hopefully by the end of the week and or further than that, we'll have some answers.
I think we'll leave it there. And I want to thank my colleagues on this panel for all of your thoughts around this important topic at this important time. So thank you very much. And turn it back over to Dr. Lawrence.
Thank you so much. We were so pleased that everyone was able to join us this afternoon, and we hope that the information shared will be useful as those that participated and were panelists, as well as our participants, are challenged to rethink enrollment management for your respective campuses. Please know that SREB is committed to designing and offering resources that support you in your respective roles, especially as it relates to providing additional access points to higher education for students in our region. As Steve has already indicated, please be reminded that our final webinar in this series will take place on May 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern, and there will be a focus on community colleges and their role that they play in the higher education environment, especially during this pandemic. Again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to you potentially joining us on May 12th.
Thank you all. And a reminder, we'll send out this recording link via email. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.